Good evening and welcome to the world today. I'm in Africa, in Tanzania, to discuss with Professor Issa Shivji, a veteran of the radical movement in the country, one of the leading public intellectuals, not just in Tanzania, but in the whole of Africa. It's interesting that one is in Tanzania because this is one of the few countries in the region, in East Africa, which has not had some of the more extreme displays of violence, which we have seen in, for instance, its neighbors Kenya and Uganda. And to a large part, I think this is the result of the legacy left behind by Julius Nyerere, the first or the founding president of the newly independent Tanzania, which once was known as Tanganyika. And so it's appropriate to come to this country where there has been, harmony compared to the rest of the continent and its different states. Professor Shivji, very nice to be here and very nice to be with you. Before we move on to discussing your country and your work, I'd like to know a bit more about you. You were born here? Your family came from where?
Both my parents were born here. But I guess my grandparents must have come from India. And as was the case then, most of them came from Gujarat. One of my parents, my father, was born in Zanzibar, and my mother was born in Bukoba, which is one of the regions of Tanzania. So I have grown up totally here. And I had some experience of the colonial period because I was born in 46, the 50s period. And I also witnessed Tanganyika's independence in 1961.
And what was the atmosphere during the independence struggle as a young person?
My personal experience of independence is that the colonial society, of course, was a segregated society where the hierarchy of races. Whites at the top, Asians in the middle, and Africans at the bottom.
Like in many parts of Africa, or British colonialized Africa.
Absolutely. And I think they very effectively used the Asian middle person as a kind of buffer.
Against the Africans.
Against the Africans. So in that sense, my surroundings and the community, of course, had mixed feelings. On the one hand, there was this fear of what would independence mean to them. But on the other hand, I remember as a young person, when I saw our leaders talking and so on, I used to keep a notebook and I would paste pictures of the new leaders with captions, describing them. And once I started the secondary school, then I was exposed more and more to independence and the rights of people.
I was making notes both for our interview and for various other things I'm going to be doing in Tanzania. And I reread this morning the famous Arusha Declaration made by Julius Nyerere, written as a manifesto for his party, effectively, almost exactly 50 years ago.
Yes.
Now, at that time, Isa, I don't know about you, but many of us who were following Africa closely, we didn't criticize it, but we thought, oh, well, you know, what does it mean? It's not radical enough.
Yes.
Why isn't he talking about making a revolution, etc., etc.? Reading it today in the cold light of day, 50 years later, I found it astonishingly radical. It explains what socialism should be, not simply the state is there, but the participation of ordinary people in transforming their own lives. A lot of attention is paid to that. The right of people to speak their minds, to participate at every level of the state, freedom of the press, etc., etc., etc. And yet, you feel that if the Arusha Declaration were implemented, to even talk about it being implemented now in Eastern Africa, or say the whole of Africa, why not? People would sit up and say, you guys are mad. Yet this is something a party in Eastern Africa tried to do 50 years ago.
You are absolutely right. And we, as young radical students at that time, were critical, particularly on Nyerere's views on socialism. And we felt that he wasn't going far enough. And we had debates. And I must say, with hindsight, that he tolerated us a lot.
The government?
Yes, the government.
They didn't stop you debating?
No, they didn't stop. See, I think one thing that has sort of dawned upon us, the young radicals of the time, given the current situation everywhere in the world, is that Nyerere's nationalism was in many ways a kind of unique nationalism. It was not narrow nationalism. One thing that he really fought against was any kind of expressions of ethnicity, race, and so on. And one of the things that he firmly believed on, which of course has been the long tradition of socialism, is equality of all human beings. And he took it very seriously, although we didn't appreciate at the time of the unity. Because he kept saying that what we are trying to do is to build a nation. We have not inherited a nation from colonialism. Okay? So we are trying to build a nation. And how do you build a nation? So for him, unity was above everything else. And I think that was at the time very important. To a certain extent, we are now enjoying that legacy of unity. Although now, with neoliberalism, fractures have started to appear. Okay? But one thing consistently argued that don't ethnicize politics. Okay? You may have ethnicism, ethnical groups as your expression of diversity, but don't ethnicize politics.
What about tribalism?
Exactly, and that's what he meant.
Because in Kenya, there was
yes,
a huge
absolutely.
tribal conflict.
Absolutely. Looking with hindsight, we could have developed tribalism. Okay, if not tribal, definitely regionalism, which is beginning to rear its head. Okay, but we owe to Nyerere that he tried to unite, and he never accepted. He's absolutely very strong on it. Okay, and one thing is that very early in the independence period, almost a year after independence, he abolished chiefs. Chiefdoms were abolished in this country. Okay. And chiefs were, some of them from pre-colonial times, but some of them were actually created by colonialism.
Of course.
They were created by colonialism. Yeah. And colonialism used tribalism to divide the people. And that become symbols of tribes, you know. But he abolished chiefdom very early in the period, you know. And he even managed to get some of them on his side in the national movement.
What was his Nyerere's own background, Isa?
Nyerere himself came from a small ethnic group called Wazanaki. And he came from a chiefly family, but his father was one of the persons who was created by colonialism as chief. But from his childhood, and he actually went to school at a very late age, at 11. Before that, he was like any other peasant child, accompanying his mother to fields, doing hoeing, looking after cattle, livestock, and so on. And one thing that he, from very early period, kind of detested was hierarchy, inequality. And although he was a devout Catholic, in private, he did not like hierarchy that you find in Catholicism.
What is the religious structure of the country in terms of Christianity, Islam, whatever?
Some would say that it's almost equal. Okay. Some would say that Muslims are slightly larger and so on. But we don't only have Muslims and Christians, but we also have, of course, derogatorily called pagans by the colonialists, but people who follow traditional religions.
Like in Nigeria?
Yeah, like as opposed to imported religions. So they also form a big group, although increasingly, of course, it is diminishing.
Move now to what began to happen to these countries, of course, your own country, but Africa in the 80s, when the International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment programs, when the old dreams of socialism effectively died or were killed off and people were unhappy, given what was happening in other parts of the world and in Africa itself. And then after the final victory of the United States and their empire and their system, everyone, or not everyone, but most politicians clambered onto the bandwagon.
Right.
And effectively abandoned independent politics and embraced money. The clink, clink, clink of money became a dominant feature in political life, not just in Africa, but all over the world. This is a sort of universal phenomenon which is refracted in different ways in different parts of the world, depending on local conditions. But effectively that happened here as well. A continent that already had enough problems, and the results have been appalling, really. Now, since the 2008 crash, there are attempts being made to introduce some degree of social democracy, but very weak attempts so far. Nothing major. As far as the political, financial elite that runs this world is concerned, all you need is a little sticking plaster and you will stem the flow of blood, and then till the next time. But the effects of all this in Africa have been dire, have they not?
They have been devastating. The structure adjustment programs in Africa, which introduced in the early 80s and continued for almost 2 decades, have been devastating, particularly at the level of social benefits. But Tanzania had gone quite far with it, okay, in terms of literacy programs, health, and so on, which was, when you look at it objectively from the point of view of political economy, it was part of the social wage of the working people. Okay? Now, with structure adjustment program, all that, of course, was removed. They were not allowed to give any subsidy, everything should be exposed to the market, okay, financialized, etc., etc. Okay? So last 5 years of Nyerere, from 1980 to 1985, were extremely critical. And I lived through it, we lived through it, so we remember it. Extremely critical. The economic situation was very bad, and people's well-being had been affected in a major way. And to a certain extent, of course, it has expressed itself in politics as well. Okay? And Nyerere's own popularity had begun to decline. I remember, Tariq, I think in 1984 I was visiting US and Canada. And a very close friend of Nyerere, who was our first principal of the University College, Pratt from Canada, took me out for dinner. And we were just around the corner for the 1985 elections. And Pratt asked me, Issa, what do you think? Should Mwalimu continue or should he not? I said, look, Cranford, let me tell you very honestly. If he continues, he'll go down. If he steps down, he'll go down in history. And Nyerere was far-sighted.
That's what he preferred.
That's what he did. And you know, some of the articulations of Nyerere. In Swahili, when he sort of finally declared that I'm going to step down, he said, I better live while I still have my senses alert. Now, if you see what has happened recently to Mugabe, when you look back at that, it makes a hell of a lot of sense.
I remember it created a huge impact.
Yes.
That elected head of state who could have been there for, quite a long time, had decided to step down voluntarily.
Absolutely, absolutely. He stepped down, and it's very interesting because the first few years he continued to be the chairman of the party, to allow for the transition. And I think his initial thought was that he would be able to do what he did in '62. Immediately after our independence, he became prime minister. After a few months, he resigned as prime minister and went back to the party to strengthen it, to strengthen the support. And I think when he stepped down in '85, he had similar ideas that he would be able to do it again. But when he went around the country and saw the state of the party, he came back very disappointed. He became very disappointed. That's number one. Number two, of course, he saw the signs and read the signs of what was happening in the world, particularly in Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he is the one who started the debate on multi-party.
So we built our leader, deliberately we build up our leader, and he also becomes this symbol of the new order. This is a dilemma of this movement. Sometimes you build the leader to the extent that at the end, when you think you have become free, the fellow has become so powerful you don't know what to do with him.
He said that for him, one party was not a matter of principle, but it was necessary. Because if we allowed multi-party, inevitably, in a country which did not have a nation, these parties will become inevitably some kind of ethnic groups with ethnic support. At that time, we didn't quite appreciate it.
It's actually thinking back.
Exactly.
It's true.
It's true.
And happened in other countries.
It has happened in other countries. He tried, I can't say with a lot of success, but he tried quite hard to have internal democracy within the party. Although at the end of the day, of course, Nyerere came out on the top. Because when we did get multi-party, Tariq, in the neoliberal circumstances, they have not been a good...
No, it's the same all over the world, that neoliberalism, I have argued non-stop, has effectively destroyed meaningful forms of democracy.
Absolutely.
It's a set of rituals. Party A is in power, Party A's politicians make a lot of money, they work with their favorite corporations, they privatize, they go on the boards of privatized companies. Party A is removed by an election. Party B, which also believes in neoliberalism, comes in and does exactly the same thing. I mean, we have a classic example at the sort of mother of parliaments, the Thatcher's Conservative Party and Blair's Labour Party. Nothing to choose between them. And of course, in the United States, this is an old story. People get worked up about Trump, and so they should. But many of the things Trump is saying was said by Reagan, was said by Nixon, was said by Bush, sometimes privately, but sometimes also publicly. Absolutely. This guy says them right into the open.
Exactly. See, when the debate on multi-party started, we had an international conference in Russia, to which Nyerere was invited. And after making his formal speech and so on, we had kind of just discussing. And at that time, there was this proliferation of parties all over Africa. We were in the multi-party enthusiasm about it, which was, of course, supported by the West. So he told us, you know what, I would like to pray to political gods, if there are any, that we should have only two parties. And both parties should be socialist, and both parties should be nationalist. And they can differ on how to implement it.
That's
he
what
says,
happens.
look at multi-party system. Look at your examples that you're giving. In the US, you're Democrats and Republicans, but both parties are capitalist, and both parties are imperialist.
Absolutely.
And it was bloody, he articulated it very well of what so-called multi-party is all about.
Yeah, and of course now this is becoming clearer and clearer to many people. So young people in many parts of the world tend not to vote because they say it doesn't matter. But linking up to all these things, the effects and impact of neoliberalism on the continent as a whole and what it's done, increased poverty, created and enlarged a class of wealthy semi-businessmen, semi-brokers who work with the West and who run these countries in different ways. And then they came up with a new way of taking people, intelligent young people, who could have been civil servants, who could have been teachers, who could have been doctors, who could have played a big part in developing these states. There's a systematic plan to take them away out of the system through this NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which I call WGOs, Western Governmental Organization, pour in money and buy over the cream of the young intelligentsia, put them on huge salaries so they are never tempted or not allowed to participate in any form of liberatory politics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The whole vocabulary and the discourse changed. At one time, we used to talk about liberation movements, okay? Not NGOs. These are supposedly non-governmental organizations funded by governmental organizations like DFID, USAID, and so on, which are governmental organizations, okay? And you are absolutely right that many people, young people who would otherwise have been involved in some kind of alternative politics, okay, are taken by NGOs. And I often talk with my friends in NGOs that one time you were being told that think globally, act locally. Now with NGOs we are being told act locally, don't think, we'll do the thinking for you. We used to consider ourselves revolutionaries, not activists.
Activist is a neoliberal word.
Exactly, just act, without thinking about what action you are taking. And the whole discourse has been transformed. But I think, of course, neoliberalism has had a short life, right? The neoliberal triumphalism is already giving way.
It's created a huge political vacuum.
Right.
Which in many cases is being filled by right-wing populist demagogy, people who come to power saying some things which it's difficult to disagree with. But when they come to power, carry on as before. It's become a stepping stone. But then there have also been the emergence of left-wing movements in Spain, in Italy, in France, in Portugal, which are challenging all this. So something is beginning to happen.
But you see, at the same time, this move, of course, the right move, also holds great dangers because from Trump to Modi, resting on very narrow nationalism, using all kinds of primordial prejudices. In Africa also we're beginning to see some kind of populisms. And obviously, as we know, populism has its very severe limits. Particularly populism is based on very narrow nationalism. But some of its rhetoric of of course attracts people because it does address certain very important issues.
Yeah.
Two things I would like to say. First, for me, neoliberalism was an ideological attack. It had nothing to do with economics, actually. It was an ideological attack not so much on communism as on radical nationalism. And the spokespeople would say it so much, that if you think that you can get out of our systems, you are dreaming. We will not allow it. So first, it was an ideological attack. And number two, all the measures that were taken, extremely polarized our societies. And this is true across the world, Even in Tanzania today, you have on the one day a small group of filthy rich, and then you have a large majority, particularly in our case because we are still a village society, living in a different world. Living in a different world. This is what, who was that Prime Minister of Britain talked about two nations?
Disraeli.
That's right, World apart.
Isa, finally, we're sitting here in Africa, and the largest, most powerful country in Africa, South Africa, has just had a party election. And Zuma, Jacob Zuma, still the president, regarded as totally corrupt by his own party.
Right.
But hanging on to power, tried to get his wife, ex-wife, nominated as his successor. That seems to have failed, fine. But Cyril Ramaphosa, once used to be a communist militant, is now the richest man in Africa. He is the one who's defeated Zuma. Doesn't that sum up, in a way, the crisis of the whole continent?
Absolutely. Tariq, I spent 2 months in Cape Town recently. I came back just about 3 weeks ago. It was amazing. On the one hand, and I was living in Cape Town, which is one of the most divided cities, a beautiful city, but very divided. You could well be in the apartheid era, okay? But on the other hand, I kept talking to comrades in South Africa. Still, I don't know how long it will last. South Africa society, massive debates. It doesn't take time for them to come out on the streets, demonstrate, critique, okay? So Zuma, left, right, and center, the way there was criticism against him, very impressive. In spite of everything, still one institution in the state, in the bourgeois state, obviously, which seems to function, is the judiciary in South Africa. Now you talk to me about this succession. It is. Cyril Ramaphosa, I always felt, here was a man, here was a man comes from that tradition. And how do people just metamorphose? Just can't understand. Remember, he was implicated in the Marikana massacre, and he now becomes, and yet what choice did the people have in those circumstances? What choice? And I think this is one real gap. And probably it is also a critique of whatever left formations that we had. Just when there is a vacuum, just when people are looking for an alternative, the left is not there to provide alternative, a credible alternative. And one of the reasons was that the intellectual body was really decimated by neoliberalism. It was decimated. Our universities were starved of resources. People moved, they became migrants. Many of them, our professionals and so on, went abroad. So when we come to write about this period, what they have done, in many ways it's actually worse than what colonialism did. Colonialism had some responsibility, but the neoliberals had no responsibility. Had no accountability at all.
Isa, on that note, we must bring this to an end. It's been a real pleasure seeing you, talking to you, and in Tanzania.
Thank you, Tariq. It was great.
Sometimes I get annoyed, but sometimes I don't get annoyed. Here I am, former president of my country, no problem in Tanzania. We've never had these problems that they have. But I'm an African, and they see me, and they ask me the problems of Rwanda. I said, but I don't come from Rwanda. But you come from Africa.
What's the difference?
But I don't meet everybody. I don't meet an Englishman somewhere. Huh? If Blair was to come to Dar es Salaam, I don't ask him what is happening in Bosnia.